Good morning, everybody. Welcome to round 6 of the Asian Schools Debating Championship. Thank you all for being here. My name is Nishant, and I'll be your chair today. As you with me is Arjun from the Philippines and Osiva from Bangladesh. In team proposition, we have Summerfield 1, and team opposition, we have Ateneo 1. We'll clap once at the first minute, once again at the 6th minute, POIs only between the first and 6th minute, clap twice at the 7th minute, 3 times at 7:30. If we don't stop talking about them, we will keep tapping obnoxiously until we lose. So, on the motion, this House believes that developed countries that historically pollute more have more obligations to give up part of their land to sinking countries, so something to that effect. We would like to invite the Prime Minister to confirm the motion and stand
Every development has cost. We believe that these costs are to be met by the countries that are being benefited because of these economic development. Even if economic development or these costs are not the main primary reasons of this debate, we tell you that there are several other reasons why these countries have a moral obligation to provide lands to the countries that will sink in the near future. We tell you that at the end of the day, why is this the best option? We'll be proving it under under 4 layers. But before that, the policy, right? We'll be allocating the land now, which will be done under United Nations supervision, and the land will be allocated for these nations that are under environmental danger. We tell you that we'll be giving this land to them within the immediately now, and they'll be developed for the next 10 or 20 years accordingly to the needs of those nations that will be moving there. Because because when you give the land at a sudden moment, we believe that there will be no time to go there and mitigate all the problems, move there and have a proper nation. We also tell you that the land will be acquired by the nations that currently hold the lands from the private landowners through the proper law systems that they have in their nation. So moving on to the arguments, right? Why is this the best option, and why anything such as compensations or carbon taxations have not worked and will not work and are just simply damage controls, and you need to save lives. But before moving on, yes sir.
Does that mean that companies will now have its own sovereign land and have its own government in US land?
Yes, they will, because we tell you that if they are counted, if they're not counted as a part of Maldives in United States, we tell you that they're counted as refugees to begin with, and we have a problem with that as well. They're not going to be citizens of United States. They're going to have a separate country, and we're going to tell you exactly why we're going to do that. Right? What are compensations, and what do they do to begin with? They might come up and talk about that. You know what? They can pay money to these nations who are being harmed to begin with. We tell you that these compensation can't bring the water levels down, can't have any effect to have an irreversible process that can make the environment livable again, right? We tell you that these compensations to begin with are nothing compared to these developed nations, and they're not ready to pay them, because these every single protocol or every single Kyoto protocols and whatnot, they have not worked till now, because countries do not want anything that harms their economy. We know that there is existence of carbon taxation, but we tell you that these are just damage control, and they do not take account of the carbon emission of the past 200 years that have been done. Therefore, the carbon emission that are being done in today's world, and we tell you that most of the countries do not follow them to begin with, and most of the countries buy those limits from other nations, and the carbon emission is still being done in the status quo. So how is this justified, and how does this solve all these problems, and how this is the best policy that we have? So why is this justified, right? Why does these developed nations have an obligation to provide these lands? It's not because they're developed, it's not only because of they're developed and they're capable of doing so. We tell you that this is because of the sins of their fathers and something that their ancestors have done. How does a society function, and what is a society to begin with? So society is a collective group of people. When we tell you that the majority of this nation have harmed other people, we tell you that the government takes the accountability, and the government are accountable for the harm to begin with. We tell you that from a very moment, this social apathy has started years ago. They did not think that, you know what, my next generation will have to pay for it. We tell you the very moment you have stricter laws for social apathy, we tell you that these nations are more cautious. We tell you that these nations have to take the responsibility for something a majority of their society has done. We tell you the very moment that is done, society functions perfectly. No one is thrown away from the society, and you're not telling them that you know what, you're alone on your own, even if you're the majority, we don't care about you, screw you. Moving on.
How is it we're only looking at living on developing nations if most of the world pollutes anyway?
See, most of the world has not polluted the environment in the past. We tell you that historically, these countries have polluted the environment and have developed themselves and now capable enough. And we tell you that in those times, countries such as countries that are suffering now did not have enough political power or did not have enough knowledge to stop countries such as United States of America or China from stopping this from stopping this environmental harm. We also tell you that how this generation is being benefited because of their ancestors. You take benefits from your ancestors, you do not pay for them. We tell you that at the end of the day, these generation is having economic development at the cost of what? Social apathy, right? You did not care that what happens to other nations who are near the sea levels. You did not care what happens to people who do not know enough about environment. You did not care about people who are living under threat. All you cared about that, you know what, I have to be rich, my pocket has to have a lot of money. We tell you that these are the attitude, and we tell you that in order for them to be paid, we believe that we believe that this punishment must match the things they have done. That is being benefited of economic development at the cost of social appetite. We tell you when you give them a land, it's mitigated, and you give and it's a reconciliation for the social appetite that has been going on for years. Because now you give them a proper land which is free of environmental danger to begin with. And what is the effectiveness of this motion? We tell you that for years people have realized that, you know what, I'll go to something such as Kyoto Protocol, sit down there and get out of it. And social appetite is something I don't need to care about, because I do not care about what happens to my son's son. Because at the end of the day, what we need to, because they know that they're not going to live for the next 100 years, and they do not need to care about the environment. The very moment we take a cautious step, governments realize that the next time we do something like that, there will be even harsher punishment. Even if we believe that all these reasons are not enough and they do not have a moral obligation on the basis of the cost they have incurred, we tell you that they have a moral obligation to save lives, and they're capable of doing so. Let's think about the population density of countries such as United States, Canada, or China. We believe these countries are not densely populated to begin with. Where you can fit in 100 or 200 people, you have 1 or 2 people living in these areas. A 30-minute walk would not make you meet with a person but a bear. We tell you that there are barrenlands to begin with, and they have a responsibility to save lives. Even if you do not have, and now what Navid will come up and talk about, that even if they're not counted as a part of their society, they might come up and talk about that, you know what, there are refugees and whatnot. We tell you that how families are important and are a social fiber that works, and that is exactly why they need to go into those lands and have their own lands in those nations. With that, we believe that the motion should pass.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And open the case of slide opposition, let's have your opposition.
For the thousands of environmental refugees, day in and day out, who hope to find some kind of solution, and hope to find someone to blame, we can understand their plight, but we simply don't think that you can put the blame solely onto these developed countries. And we believe that under their policy, you're only going to make the condition of these refugees worse. You're going to make it harder for these countries to properly improve themselves. What is the stance that side opposition has in this debate? We support the status quo, in which we think that citizens of countries have already sought refugee status from other countries and things like that. And we think that more often than not, most of these countries that they go to have already shown a willingness, such as Canada, during the Typhoon High in the Philippines, was willing to lighten its immigration policies to make sure that more people can go into your country. Furthermore, we're also going to support the idea of granting these refugees more job opportunities and the capacity for them to work their way into citizenship so that they can live a good life to begin with. But what we're simply standing for is that we think these countries still have a right to filter out the kinds of people they choose to have in their country at the end of the day. We are not standing for the idea of granting them land for these people. I have 2 points for you today. Firstly, why we cannot impose a moral obligation, and secondly, on how you can encourage better protection for refugees under our policy. But before that, I have one key point for rebuttal onto their case. Firstly, the main point for rebuttal I have is this idea on accountability. We have 3 levels of response. Firstly, we know that entire case never gave a clearly established link as to why there's direct accountability from this developed country towards the other country like Maldives to begin with. Because even if they kept pushing us to the idea of the intergenerational pollution, they never told us as to how that intergenerational pollution coming from the past actually pinpoints the kinds of disasters and environmental harms that exist right now to begin with. The point of information my part gave you is that there are numerous factors that could determine the pollution that exists for these countries. You can't necessarily put the main point or the main responsibility onto these countries. But secondly, we even question the idea that these countries have not learned from their mistakes in the past and from the environmental pollution they did before. Even the most developed of countries have already started going towards a movement of environmental pollution reduction, right? We can give you an example of how Barack Obama just announced that he's willing to cut out 30% of his carbon tax emissions in America just recently. But thirdly and finally, we also need to realize that we don't think there's necessarily a sin to begin with, or there's no malicious intent of these countries to actually commit these kinds of environmental pollution, because eventually almost all countries, for the sake of their own interest, has to make sure they can grow economically at the end of the day. So no thank you. So we don't think that this entire point on accountability necessarily applies if they've never actually established to us as why there should be clear direct accountability onto these states. Let's go now towards my first point. My first point is on why we cannot impose a moral obligation on these states. Before that, sir.
Sir, these countries are actively refusing to sign contracts like Kyoto Protocol and G20 summits. Please tell me how they are regretting what they have done and how they are paying for their mistakes.
These countries are actually even in our worst case scenario, right, where there are some countries who are going against these kinds of policies. We think that they have done these kinds of things for a reason, and eventually we think that they will learn that they need to preserve their environment as well. Because when environmental harms happen, there are also massive forms of pressure within their own internal politics to make sure they reduce their environmental harms to begin with. That's the example that exists right now in Thailand, which they are trying to improve themselves, or the idea of Indonesia, after the Great Indonesian Fire, creates massive amounts of health risks towards their own people, right? Let's go to the first point, on why you cannot impose a moral obligation. First thing we need to ask, what constitutes an obligation to begin with? We know that an obligation is constituted by a direct harm that can objectively be traced back towards one kind of person to begin with. And if we give you numerous examples where we gave you an obligation to countries, we give the idea of Indonesia, the Great Indonesian Fire, in which smoke itself reached towards the Singaporean citizens and towards another country, and we made them accountable for that. We also give you the example of Canada, in which we clearly established that the Great Fire that exists in Canada greatly affected the US citizens who were affected and had massive risks of asthma in that case. What we need to ask is how come this obligation cannot exist for these particular countries to begin with in a historical context? There are 3 reasons why. Firstly, in the case of historically pollutive countries, we cannot scientifically prove a direct link towards them to begin with. Because we need to ask numerous questions here. Is it really the US that led towards the pollution of an entirely different country on the other side of the map, like the Maldives? What if it was actually India's fault? What if it was China's fault? Or what if, in the worst case scenario, what if it was just another natural cause that actually led to these things? The point is, there are numerous factors that could have led towards this environmental harm, and you can't necessarily pinpoint one single blame on towards one single actor. In fact, we think that when it comes to historical pollution, it's extremely too vague for you to do that, because there are numerous factors that could affect that pollution or the amount of damage that could have done. But secondly, we think that it was based on an extremely arbitrary standard, given the fact that numerous countries all over the world actually pollute at the end of the day. You can't necessarily say that this developed country is the sole one that actually led towards this environmental pollution, especially when other developing countries like the Philippines, like Vietnam, and China are actually polluting as well. But thirdly and finally, simply put, because we don't think there is any malicious active intent to doing that, because almost all countries need to make sure don't hate the environment and burn it because of hatred, right? Very often they do it for their own sake of economic growth, meaning that all countries have right to economically develop their country at the end of the day. So what we need to ask the government in this debate is, why are they imposing a standard onto these countries when there could be numerous factors that could determine accountability? More than the obligation, what concrete harms can come from their side? Because we think when it comes to demanding land, it's far too great of a cost for any small amount of accountability that they might pose to us. Because this means you're allocating resources for your economy which you extremely rely on for sustainable growth, and thousands of people live in the country. In the same way that you're trying to move these refugees to Maldives, you're doing the exact same thing towards Americans and thousands of Europeans in your country. So what's the conclusion? I mean that firstly, we question the very accountability that exists right now, but secondly, on their best case scenario where you can establish accountability, we simply think that the punishment is too unproportional and is far too great for the little accountability that you can place onto these countries. Secondly, now let's go towards the second point, on where can we better protect these refugees. Because we think that we need to give a comparison between the both models that our sides give. Firstly, let's look towards their model and let's question the kinds of things that can happen. First thing I want to question, what makes them think that that these countries will actually give them proper sustainable land to begin with? It's likely that they will place them in lands which are have little economic growth to make sure they will offset the cost to begin with. And this is extremely harmful for the condition of these refugees because they won't get a capacity to farm, to get food, or anything like that. But secondly, what makes them think that these people are actually capable of creating their own institutions or creating their own government, because they don't necessarily have the economic capacity to create these institutions with enough money. And even if we do give them aid, they might not necessarily get the capacity or the capability of creating that. And thirdly, what makes them think they will give them any more? Because they will just stick to this obligation and not give them any kind of aid to begin with, because it is already too great of a cost. So why is our side better? I think that when countries are actually willing to help these people, there is more institutions, there's better protection for these people. Because this means you get welfare, you get job opportunities, you get better help for these people because of the fact that they have an active willingness to help them. But more importantly, because of the fact that you filter these people out, it's more likely that you have more capacity to help more of these people in a concentrated fashion, instead of having thousands of people that you have to deal with, which you might have to cut your resources much more thinner at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, if you truly want to protect these refugees, if you truly want to do what's best for all countries, stand with side opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so continue the case beside government, let's have deputy practice.
Yeah, we have a really second.
Yeah. So,
Really, the punishment should fit the crime, right? Ladies and gentlemen, what was Team Ateneo's main stance? They believe the crime, that the punishment that we are giving to all these developed countries is too unproportional to the crime that they have committed, and that USA should not pay solely for the mistakes of all developed countries that they have made in polluting the environment because they don't want to give the land to Maldives. Ladies and gentlemen, what did our policy propose? We wanted all developed countries to give up their land for all those countries to stay. You want a concerted effort in a globalized world where all countries will pay eventually for throughout the world, so that each country takes a moral obligation, so that each country joins in towards the effort to make sure that these nations are benefited. Ladies and gentlemen, are conceded to the fact that sometimes the USA will have to make sure that they give up their land in order for the Maldives to be secure, for the Maldivian people to live there. But then again, there will be countries like England, countries like Canada, which will again have to give up their land, ladies and gentlemen, for the benefit of the country and other countries who might see. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand that each country is making a committed effort. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we talk about the idea of how these developed countries are adopting a green approach, and how these developing countries are trying to simply save their economy, and that they simply deserve to have the chance to save this economy, right? Ladies and gentlemen, simple answers to this. Why? Simply because, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand that this global warming is an international problem, ladies and gentlemen. These countries, such as England, such as America, such as Germany, these countries have polluted the environment for 300 years, and the main cause of global warming and all of the economic problems. Why, ladies and gentlemen? It's because these countries have simply been polluting the environment for the longest amount of time and have caused the longest amount of harm. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, to understand why we want to make these countries pay for the sins of their fathers. It's because these countries have reached a level of economic stability and environmental stability through years of development. These undeveloped countries and developing countries have not enjoyed. These lessly developed, lowly developed countries have not been able to develop simply because of the fact that these developed countries have already polluted the environment before them. So they need these developed countries to pay for their mistakes, to pay for the fact that they have polluted the environment, and so we believe it is completely justified to make sure that these developed countries pay the environment. Because at the end of the day, these developed countries are simply paying for what they're enjoying. If they're benefited now for something their ancestors did, we want to make them pay so that each country gets an equal standing in today's world. And we believe it is only fair to make sure that each people is treated equally, because each human life is equally important. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we've got the idea of no direct link, each country paying for the mistake. We've got developing countries having high pollution, and there is no malicious intent by developed countries to actually harm the environment. You need to understand, even if there is no malicious intent by developed countries, right, ladies and gentlemen, they're still harming the environment. They're still destroying the country, right? They're still destroying the entire world. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, it's because they've already done so in the past, ladies and gentlemen, and they've already done a harm which is irreversible. Why? Because it's almost extremely difficult to make sure that sea levels go down to the national level by a long margin, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, to understand that even if developing countries have high pollution rates now, they have nothing compared to countries like China, compared to countries like America, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, we still believe it is the fault of these developed countries to make sure that they pay for the mistakes. Thirdly, we talk about the idea of refugees, right? Why refugees are going to be not going to be benefited here. You need to understand that these countries, the piece of land that we're going to give the refugees, is going to be developed for the next 10 to 20 years, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to make the United Nations pay to that. We are going to make the developed countries pay to that very fact, ladies and gentlemen, to make sure that these people are benefited, ladies and gentlemen. We believe the governance will be stable because the countries already have a democratic system in most countries to allow them to have a stable governing body, ladies and gentlemen. There are people who understand that they will die if the action is not taken, ladies and gentlemen. The people realize that there is a problem that exists in the status quo, and they will definitely try their best to make sure that they are getting a chance to save themselves, ladies and gentlemen. Before we move on to construction, I want to visit this house, sir.
Why is it that waiting for a citizenship and you getting access to all the already established institutions is very deficient?
Oh yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, they believe that we should give refugees a chance. These refugees the chance to become a citizen in the USA, right? Ladies and gentlemen, let's consider this. These refugees, ladies and gentlemen, are simply still going to be refugees inside the developing country, ladies and gentlemen. There's still going to be people who are here simply because they could not save their own land, ladies and gentlemen. These people are still going to be here because they are given the mercy of these developed countries. They're never going to have their own culture. They're never going to have their own governance. They're simply going to be subservient culture to another land, ladies and gentlemen. You need to understand that once we are making someone pay for their mistakes, you need to make sure that they pay correctly, ladies and gentlemen. Simply by making sure that they pay a falsified assumption, by a fallacy, ladies and gentlemen, it is entirely wrong to force them, these refugees, to stay in these countries, because it's entirely wrong to make them live inside another government, to make them lose their culture, to make them lose their land, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to constructive. Ladies and gentlemen, talk about why my concern in today's house is why this leads to sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, first here. This is a very drastic policy, ladies and gentlemen. Why is there social apathy about the environmental movement? It's because these developed countries cannot look past the next 10 years, right? They cannot look past the fact they are going to have to be economically stable, that USA is going to have to compete with China for the next 10 years. But right now, the governments are focused only on economically developing themselves. But when they see such a drastic move by the United Nations, when they see such a concerted effort by the developed nations to develop the entire world so thoroughly to make sure that each country gets benefited so thoroughly, at that time they're forced to take notice that they have to do something about it. They have to make sure that do not make mistakes, that they have to make sure the environment is developed to that certain extent. At that point of time, the idea of social inaction comes to them so much more strongly. They realize that they have made mistakes in the past, and they have an active responsibility to reduce that mistake, ladies and gentlemen. The active responsibility to make sure that the payroll pay for their mistake, ladies and gentlemen. We force upon them the moral obligation that makes them understand that there is something wrong with the way they have acted for the 10 to 20 years. We need to understand the problem with the Kyoto Protocol, right? The USA and China cannot trust each other not to develop while the other is developing, right, ladies and gentlemen? So there's a problem that exists. We believe that the USA and China will now be forced to work together in order to make sure that all nations survive, and that there will be a concerted policy and concerted development through that. And G20 summits, the Kyoto Protocol summits will work. Secondly, we talked about the people inside the developed nations and also other developed nations. These people understand that there is an absolute need that their governments are being forced to give up land, a piece of their sovereignty to another nation, ladies and gentlemen. They understand the government is taking a huge risk and a huge action, ladies and gentlemen. It shows the people that the government that were elected democratically is working so hard in order to make sure that other countries are benefited, ladies and gentlemen. It shows a top-down change. The people feel more responsible for the actions that they're taking in today's world. People realize that they have done something wrong in the past, and they are going to try to make sure that they pay attention to cutting the bills, ladies and gentlemen, to making sure they save electricity and to be a more greener citizen. We believe that the entire world, once it becomes greener, will lead to much more sustainable development, and Philippines, if they die out in the next 10, 60 years, Bangladesh, if they go underwater in the next 50 years, will definitely be saved. Do it for the sake of all those developing nations that need your help, ladies and gentlemen. Pass the motion and save the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, to extend the case of salvation, let's have the deputy hero.
If I want to quote the previous speaker, as he said that the punishment should be proportionate to the crime, we believe it's not like we're going to allow these people to just die off and stay there and for this land to sink. Obviously, we have a progressive effort for these countries to help, but what we are fighting for is not to give them a moral obligation, not to force them, because those are the harms that we explicitly told you from our leader of opposition that they have failed to respond to. We believe that our approach is more of a distributive effort, that we're telling all other people, either if you are a developed country, if you are willing to accept based on your capacity and willingness, so that it's more appropriate for you to allow these people to enter your land, or if you allow other people, like even developing countries, to take part in actions or such efforts to help these people slow down the process of climate change, or them sinking, or even just paying compensation fees for these people, even if you are a developing country. We believe this is a distributive justice, when you allow people to pay for the crime, not to blame, so put the blame solely on these developed countries, because it's not their blame to begin with, and not solely their crime to begin with. And I have two arguments to extend the case of opposition side. Firstly, how you concentrate massive accountability, to solely small percentage of the world, and how on your side this promotes complacency. And secondly, I'll talk about social and international backlash, the idea of negative perception or blame when land is ultimately stolen for you illegitimately at the end of the day. But before that, I have 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, the idea that we need to pay for the ancestors' mistakes and whatnot, and I have 3 levels of response. Firstly, this is our response to the Prime Minister, because we told you can't put a direct association to solely these minimal developed countries, because there are numerous factors as to why climate change happens. You can't blame America's pollution if it's so minimal, or just America and China for creating that big of a massive problem, which is that of climate change, or that big of a massive, a natural process at the end of the day. But secondly, we believe you cannot blame these people for being efficient, because even Philippines can give up pollution as much as US or other developed countries, but necessarily US was able to be more efficient, and that's why they're developed. Some countries still pollute a lot, but it's just them not giving the fruits of their labor or not. Why are them, excused from giving liability or accountability at the end of the day? Thirdly, we believe that we always have ways to help them. It's not like we're going to leave them to die, right? Obviously, we have things like immigration or allowing them to enter, because we know they're in a difficult situation. But thank you, sir. But secondly, we also have things to slow down processes of the climate change. That's why we have incentives to make green technology. That's why we have incentives to help these people if they need help in developing or help, these climate change efforts. We believe it's not like we're going to leave them out of the open. And we believe it's more better on our side when these people are actually willing. Second thing I want to rebut, when the idea that giving land, giving the land of developed nations so that they can develop in the next 20 years, whatnot. And I have 2 levels of response. Firstly, this is unresponsive to the most likely scenario that obviously US won't give them the most potent land. Obviously, they might give them wastelands because they're just fulfilling their moral obligation at the end of the day. It doesn't require you to give you the best land where there's farmlands or all these other waters or the beach resorts, right? But in the second level response, even if you force it to give the good land, that gives a greater damage and does not justify the proportionality or the thing you have to pay back to these countries at the end of the day. It's more likely that people will hate on you because you're taking away or slowing down their own economic growth. You're taking away a big part of the resources that they could have used at the end of the day. No, thank you. Third thing I wonder about is the idea of sustainable development, because apparently China and US will help work together at the end of the day, right? No, thank you. First off, response is ridiculous. You know why? Because people obviously will not, work together just because they have to take in refugees. But the more likely scenario is that no, people will actually be more complacent. Why? Because you can put the liability solely on US, you can put the liability solely on China, and I don't have to have efforts because I know that they can take the damage and they can take away all these efforts, and they will be responsible for the damage mitigation at the end of the day. But secondly, if you want to talk about critical mass, the pressure to help these people, obviously, if it's a natural process for you, obviously people will not be oblivious to the idea that climate change is a problem, and that's why they have numerous progressive efforts as to why they're doing it. So at the end of the day, we believe they're unresponsive to the numerous harms that they themselves brings, and we believe it's better on our side at the end of the day. First argument, how you concentrate massive accountability to solely a small percentage, and how this promotes complacency. Because following the Prime Minister's characterization, either it's a natural process of climate change, or a minimal percentage of the damage is from, or you can associate to developed nations. What's the problem on your side? You actually promote complacency at the end of the day. Why? On three levels. Firstly, if you talk about the developed countries, it's more likely for them to fulfill their obligation just by giving land and stop trends from actually the numerous progressive trends that are actually happening, such as aid or green technology. Because for my part, if I give the land, I'm already doing or taking my part as action. That's my solution to you. As long as I give you land, no matter what land it is, it's okay for me to say that no, I will stop my efforts already because you already took a part and I fulfilled my obligation. But on the second level, we believe even for the Maldives citizens or these people or the victims of these actions will be more complacent. Why? Because they don't have to do any effort. They don't have to go to other nations to ask for help as a refugee or all these other things. Because for them, as long as whatever happens, US or China will automatically accept me because they're morally obliged to do so. Right? It's more likely for me to be complacent and to stop effort because at the end of the day, I'll be in. US will give me my own land. I don't have to care about my neighbor's land or whatnot, right? But the third level response, and a third level of argument, more importantly, if you're talking about other developed countries, it becomes a justification for them to even pollute even more. Because obviously, even if I pollute more, the blame or the the liability will be solely targeted or associated with US or China because they are the developed countries. Even if the Philippines pollute a lot, it's more likely you cannot put the blame on the Philippines because they're developing countries, even if they're a developing country, even if they're polluting a lot, because obviously when you have a moral, if you're forcing the developed countries to accept these people for the pollution, the liability will solely put on these developed countries at the end of the day. So the problem on your side is the benefit of our side is we'd rather have a distributed solution where all people have efforts and stop complacency from happening, that whether it be American citizens or Maldives citizens or even developing countries have a continuous effort in fighting this problem. Second thing I want to argue, the social or international backlash. Because what is happening on government side is basically you require developed countries and it's to give up the land to others to take. What's the problem there? This is what creates a negative perception and image to these nations because it generally becomes a reason for you, a legitimate reason for you to blame them for these things. What do I mean? If I'm a US citizen and I know that a Maldives citizen took away my land, obviously I won't be pleasant. Yay, it's okay for you to take my land. Obviously, you will label or tag these people to blame. We believe whether tangibly, in terms of economic growth, if it's lessened with deprivation of the land, or even just a basic negative image of these people, what's the problem there is that you cannot, the label is correlated to the actions of how these people or how these nations will be treated in the international sphere. What will happen? Obviously, these people will not be looked pleasant upon. People will obviously more likely be alienated from the international sphere. Why? Because there will always be international rejection if these things were not legitimately gained and whatnot. We believe the problem there because you need the international community to actually aid you, and we need the help or the support of the international community at the end of the day. We believe you won't get on that side if you morally force them at the end of the day. So comparatively speaking, we believe it's better on our side because we stop people from, we have a continuous effort, we do not stop the trend at the end of the day, and that's why Ateneo's very proud to oppose.
Okay, for the final time speaker, we got the bench, whenever you're ready, go.
Give me a minute count. Oh, now it's minute count.
Timekeeper. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'll be doing in my speech is giving a thematic analysis of what has happened in the debate so far. So the debate boils down to primarily three themes. That is, first of all, is the punishment equal to the proportionality of the crime? And secondly, will the people of the developed countries accept them or not? And thirdly, are there other ways of mitigating this problem? First of all, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to talk about the proportionality, right? They come up and talk to us about how we cannot measure who has created how much damage, right? Yes, we concede to that fact. But we also understand that the balance of probability exists. If India has been harming by industrializing for 20 years, USA has been doing it for over 200 years, ladies and gentlemen. And what is more likely is USA has done more harm in 200 years than India could have probably done in 20 years, ladies and gentlemen. And even today, USA is continuously doing that harm, ladies and gentlemen. And Barack Obama cutting down 20% of carbon isn't in the interest of us, but it is in the interest of themselves, because they have been exceeding their carbon limits, and that is harming their reputation in the international arena, ladies and gentlemen. They come up and talk to us about how these punishments are not equal and how it's unfair on the people. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe a country is not about each and every individual separately. It is about the collective benefits of the country, and a country is a single entity when it comes to taking foreign policies and foreign decisions and international decisions, ladies and gentlemen. We believe we do not care if the people of the country feels bad, because at the end of the day, this is the moral and ethical thing to do. It's to saving the lives, ladies and gentlemen. Now, then they come up and talk to us about how, if there are other methods of actually mitigating these problems. They come up and talk about refugees. First of all, they come up and tell us how refugees are given citizenship and what not, right? Ladies and gentlemen, on a primary level, we believe refugees will never feel at home knowing that they're in another country's mercy and they're being governed by another country's people, and that they do not have a community or culture to live in, ladies and gentlemen. I, as a Bangladeshi, will never like to live in Jackson Heights just because there are Bangladeshis only, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to live in a place where I can make my own decisions, I can select my own government, ladies and gentlemen, where people do not look at me as just a foreigner, some alien immigrants, ladies and gentlemen. I want to live in a country where they call me a citizen, they call me their own, ladies and gentlemen. And that is where the emotionality and the integration, social integration starts, ladies and gentlemen. If you feel foreign in a country, however developed it is, however much it might help you, you will never feel at home, ladies and gentlemen. And it is very important that you feel at home to be able to sustainably develop in any sort of way, ladies and gentlemen. And then and there, we move on to the idea of how people, their worst case and our best case scenario, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, their best case, under their best case scenario, we have some refugees who are not willing to work with each other, and they come up and talk about people hating us, people hating the refugees, people hating these people from other developing countries because they came up and took over their land. We tell you, that doesn't happen on a primary level, and on a secondary level, under their policy, that happens more. Because now, if an Indian comes up to United States of America and he takes away my job just because USA has given him entrance to our country, I believe I'll hate him either way for taking away my job, ladies and gentlemen. And their policy fails to negate the very problem that they identify. Not taken, sir. Moving on, they come up and talk about how refugees will be, how our policy will actually make sure that they hate each other, right? Ladies and gentlemen, that being the worst case scenario is still better than people living in the same community, inside the same border, hating each other. There is a border between to stop this hatred and to stop any kind of problems arising in the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. And there are two government entities, separate bodies to actually make sure that there is a check and balance mechanism which does not exist when you are in a foreign land. Because I believe a US government personnel will not favor a Bangladeshi refugee as well as he will prefer a US citizen, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on, they come up and talk to us about how the land is not developed and they won't give us developed lands, right? Ladies and gentlemen, we believe Texas was essentially a desert 100 years back. You develop by this time, we are giving you 25 to 30 years to develop that land and sustainably live there, economically grow, and then move in and live a proper life. We believe you do not need developed land to begin with. You can develop it in the time frame that we are giving you in the very first place. Development does not come on the first place, right? Moving on, they came up and talked to us about how the social integration of we came up and talked to you about how the social development and refugee rights and own culture and government matters. They fail to negate why this doesn't happen, right? They come up and talk about the efficiency We believe it is not about the efficiency that matters in development. What also the time frame matters. How many years you have to develop, right? We do not believe that just being efficient can put you ahead by 300 years. It can probably put you ahead by 5 or 10 years, not 300 years. So it's not the efficiency that matters. It is the time frame that you have to develop in the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on, they come up and talk to us about the worst and best case scenario, right? I have shown to you how our worst case scenario is still better than their best case scenario, ladies and gentlemen. Before I move on, yes, sir.
Source of sustainable development. Some countries could grow in the short term, so they have the money to create green technology. To call out environmental damage, that's just China is creating green technology right now. It has national incentive.
Sir, we believe, as Miraz has come up and talked to you about how there's a bigger deterrence now, because now China is developing these green technologies even to a minimal level to meet the international laws. But now, under our policy, these countries know that if we screw over with the environment again, there will be bigger consequences where we might have to do bigger things. And then and there, the deterrence to develop green technology and sustainable methods is more relevant, ladies and gentlemen. These countries have a bigger incentive to work on this very project and actually help us sustainably develop the whole world, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on, they came up and talked to us about how the trace back, right? Ladies and gentlemen, tracing back. Let's see, when United States of America actually started developing. They started developing in the late 1700s, ladies and gentlemen, when the countries like India, Bangladesh, and others just imported spice, which just grew there naturally, and people in Brazil fished and ate from the wildlife, ladies and gentlemen. By the time USA had train tracks, no other country has even heard of train tracks. By the time they had coal engine, no one knew what that was. And by that, the industrialization, ladies and gentlemen, has traced back to 300 years when the United States had started developing and harming the environment, ladies and gentlemen. And by that time, Bangladesh wasn't, people didn't even know Bangladesh existed. Christopher Columbus didn't know that he had found USA and thought it was India, ladies and gentlemen. By that time, George Washington was still alive and trying to sustainably develop USA. And that traces back to the very fact that developed nations are the main cause of starting these environmental damages in the very first place, in the very early age. And history is on our side, and we believe we provide deterrence, and their case, we break down their case, and our worst case scenario is better than their worst case scenario, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, Team Summerfield takes this debate home with clear margin. Thank you.
They need to stop consistently and constantly and repeatedly tell us that the United States and Europe, for example, is a very pollutive country. Okay, but we think that's not the debate. The debate is whether or not their policy is worth it, on whether or not we have to go this far just so that we can achieve the goals of this debate, right? Because here's the first thing. We think that both sides actually want to help these refugees, right? But do we really need to go this far? Do we really need to take away land from these countries? And do we really need to compromise the security of these refugees just to make this happen? We don't think that that's the case. We think that their policy is unproportional and unstrategic to the situation right now. I want to ask 3 questions. The first one is, do they have a big moral obligation to begin with? The second one is, where do we help these victims? And the last one is, where do we create sustainable policies? Let's go to the first one, on moral obligation. We're not going to contest the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that the United States or Europe was very pollutive. But where do we draw the line, and where do we actually obligate a certain country to do something? Even in the first level of response, we only obligate the country when there is a direct harm, and when the correlation between the harm and the person is something that's so direct that you can punish that person. We gave you the example of Indonesia, where their fire actually reached Singapore. It is very identifiable. There is a very clear link between the harm. That's the fact there. But the thing is, there is no direct link between the sinking of Maldives and the pollution of the United States, for instance, or the pollution of China, for instance. We think that, for example, if the United States gives land to gives land to Maldives. Maybe all that sinking was caused by China anyway, which is a closer neighbor of Maldives to begin with. There are too many environmental factors, and right now we don't even clearly understand the dynamics of pollution to begin with. We're not even sure if carbon emissions is the reason or are the reason why there is a greater level of seawater to begin with. Those are things that we are very much unsure of, and on our side, we would rather err on the side of caution and tell you that we cannot obligate countries we don't really see it as very fully liable for all of these things. Right? So thank you. But secondly, we think that it's something that's very wrong to pinpoint the liability into a small amount of individuals or countries only, which is the developed nations. Because one, there is no malicious intent to begin with, because we think that pollution, no matter what country you are, or no matter how good your government is an inevitable reality. And we think that in the past, in the 1800s, we didn't have the best technology to make sure that everything is going to be clean, but we will always have the necessity to get away from poverty to begin with. We don't think that there was a malicious intent. We don't think it is very much inevitable for these developing countries, so we can't really fully blame them for their actions. But the thing is, what's happening on their side is that developing nations are skirting their obligation completely. Because what Deputy told you, and what has remained unresponded in government side, is the idea that now the Philippines, India, or China, for example, or Brazil, for instance, can just pollute a lot and not get punished at all, and not give up land at all, because all of the accountability is now placed towards the developed nations. No, thank you. We can, on our side, provided a better model, because what we did was a voluntary model where everyone is free to volunteer their land to give to refugees, to accept people so that they can become citizens in their countries. No, thank you. So if there's a side which actually stops people from fulfilling their obligations, it's their model where it's only concentrated to a certain set of individuals. What we do in the end is strike a balance, right? We think that these countries are polluted, but we think that there are already current trends right now where they accept environment refugees and integrate them into their countries as citizens. We don't think that there's already enough reparation. We don't have to force them into things that they did not fully do. No, thank you. Let's go to the second issue on where do we help these victims. Because their policy was mainly just, we're going to give them land, dump them there, and not do anything else, right? That's the policy given by the first speaker. That is tremendously and poorly mechanized. Because here's the first thing. If you just dump them in land, what makes you sure that that's good land to begin with? Because the United States won't give them New York or Los Angeles. Maybe they'll just end up in a Texan desert, or they'll end up in the Grand Canyon where there are no resources, there are no institutions, and there are no infrastructure currently in place. But moreover, when they said that they're not going to give, they never mentioned anything about aid or assistance. The thing is, when you have to establish your own government, that's not as easy as you just being in a certain land. That takes time. That takes resources. You have to build courts. You have to build all of these institutions in order to make that happen. So even if they want the value of government, they never really explain how they're going to get that in the first place, because we think that what's going to happen is they're going to be stuck there. They wouldn't know what to do. They're completely disorganized because this is a very new land, and they're not going to get all of the objectives that they want to have. But before I go on.
Sir, don't you think that we're giving them a time frame of 25 years, by that time they can get familiar with the land, develop it, and then live on that land?
How exactly will they become familiar, right? Because even if they stay for 10 years or 100 years, if they don't have resources, they're never going to build courts, and they're never going to build schools because they can't do that. But let's respond to the idea of culture, identity, and discrimination. The first response is culture is never tied down to your land. It doesn't mean that I'm no longer in Maldives, I cannot be a Maldivian anymore, or whatever it's called. Because in any country, for example, you will always see a Chinatown. Chinese people who are immigrants, but they still exercise their Chinese culture. Maldivians or whatever can still form communities in the United States, in Europe, and exercise their culture there. But secondly, when it comes to this idea of discrimination, that's easily solvable by anti-discriminatory laws. And we think that the United States, for example, is more liberal when it comes to that. For instance, that's why all of the Asians go there, all of the Filipinos work there as OFWs. But we think that we need to compare, right? The comparison is, it's a harm that they're going to lose the culture versus the harm of people, of thousands of individuals being displaced because we have to give land to other people. The urgency and the harm is far greater in our model, and we'd rather protect that rather than this culture, which they never really explain why that's a value to begin with. Let's go to the last question then. And where do we create environmental growth? Because they said that now countries are going to be encouraged because there's pressure. We think that this is wrong. Because what's going to happen is that countries will now be satisfied with their current efforts. Because now that I'm fulfilling my moral obligation in giving land to other countries anyway, why would I do anything more? What's going to happen is countries will be complacent and countries will only be satisfied with their current efforts. But secondly, there is already an existing trend wherein, for instance, China has changed its coal policy for the first time in 30 years, and where Obama had a 30% cap even if the Congress did not want it. We do not need to go this far. We do not harm. We don't need to harm thousands of individuals just to have this trend, because it's already happening, because it's a national and organic need to do so. For all of these reasons, because we think that we simply cannot obligate them to such a huge extent, and because we think that all of their benefits also happen on our side without any drastic policy, our side is very proud to win this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's start the second half of the debate. 5 speeches are by the House. There will be no Q&A. There will be 5 speeches, one set 3 minutes, one set 4 minutes. So any further ado, let's have the competition.
Mr. Speaker, 3 points of summary for today's debate. Firstly, on accountability, secondly, on environmental protection, and thirdly, on the protection of refugees. Firstly, on accountability. The main case that the Prime Minister gave was that these countries need to pay for the sins of their fathers. We gave you 3 key flaws and 3 key questions with regards to that case. Firstly, how far did these sins of these fathers actually extend to the harms that exist right now? From the start of this debate, my speech and the government, my opposition whip, grounded to you the numerous factors that could exist as to why these harms could happen. The idea of carbon tax, carbon emissions, or the idea of natural causes, or the idea of other countries actually playing a part in this pollution. We don't necessarily see a link as to why that would exist solely on the sins of their fathers. Secondly, we can ask ourselves, are these countries the only ones to blame? Because we told you that there are numerous other countries that have highly polluted as well. The idea of China, of India, and other developing countries that have a trend of pollution existing. But thirdly, did they even do it maliciously? Because in our case today, we've told you that all countries have to economically develop, and we told you that there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with that. But why did we actually win this issue to begin with? Because after my LO speech, in which we raised these questions on accountability, the Deputy Prime Minister and the government whip stubbornly just went on and pushed their own characteristics and their statistics on how harmful Europe is. But all those statistics are misguided and misdirected, because this debate isn't about how polluted they are. It's about whether or not that pollution itself could lead these people to being accountable and giving up their land. Because fine, those might be bad statistics, but all those statistics are meaningless if you can't establish a proper link or a proper principle as to why that should be responsible. In comparison, we've actually established to you the very standards of an obligation which the Prime Minister failed to give to us. We gave you direct links. We told the idea you have to have direct links, there have to be clear standards, and there has to be a clear sign of malicious intent. And they never engaged to us on these kinds of standards, and we've sufficiently proven to you how that exists right now. Let's go to the second idea on environmental protection. The main case from the Deputy Prime was we need to encourage sustainable development by having pressure and have a critical mass for these people. Firstly, we've told you that developing countries already have a natural incentive to do that, because the fact that internal pressure, or my POI, we've given the idea that they have the incentive to offset their environmental costs through green technology, through sustainable development on their own, right? We gave the example of China in the Yunnan province. But secondly, we also told you that they're not the only ones that actually need to deal and have environmental protection or need to improve themselves as well. Because my Deputy Leader of Opposition gave you the case on how you have to make sure that other countries are also responsible, and how you encourage massive forms of complacency onto them. We've told you that if you really want to solve environmental protection in the long term for the rest of the world, you need to make sure that you don't transfer all the blame towards these developing countries solely. The entire government whip completely ignored that entire point, and there's no form of engagement onto that to begin with. So why we won this issue is particularly because we've properly engaged you on their main principle of making sure that environmental protection can happen. We've proven to you why our side is actually better in ensuring that at the end of the day. Thirdly and finally, on the protection of refugees. Because their focus of the debate was entirely wrong, and they never actually proved to you how their model would even be effective in protecting the people they're actually standing for. In my speech alone, we gave you questions. Will they get for their land? Will they get aid? Or will they even be capable of managing and making sure that this land will be capable? And what we asked, and we've given you numerous harms that could exist, and they never answered us the question on what will they do when these harms actually happen. There's no engagement on their worst case scenario. But in comparison, we've actually told you how if you truly want to have aid, if you truly want to have the capacity, our deputy leader of opposition has told you how social international backlash will make it much harder for these countries or for these people to get the aid they need to properly develop these lands at the end of the day. And the only response we got was the idea, well, backlash will still exist. But this is exactly where my case came in, and she told you that backlash will be less likely to exist when you let these countries decide on their own how many people they can take and how many people their institutions can handle at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, if you truly want to actually realize on where can you best protect these people, if you truly want to make sure that accountability can be properly pressed, if you truly want to solve the problem of environmental harm in the long term, stand by side opposition. Thank you.
Very much. Wrap up round 6 is now government.
They have a problem with accountability, and they have a problem with the way we showed that these countries are accountable for the harms of their ancestors. We came up and talked about that, the probability of United States and China harming the environment is extremely high, with a lot of reports and whatnot. We tell you that reports exist and they are presented in Kyoto protocols and whatnot, right? And then we talked about the development to begin with, right? Because when United States had rail lines, coal mines and whatnot, other countries were not even aware of it. We tell you that they have been doing it for decades, and they are liable for that because you know what, this generation have to take the burden of the previous generations, because that is how the society functions when dealing in international affairs. They also came up and talked about alternative methods like refugees and whatnot, and suddenly in their last speeches they came up and talked about, refugees are not the main focus of the debate. We tell you that I'd like to be called as a Bangladeshi. I would not appreciate being called as a refugee who lives in Chinatown in a certain country. We tell you the social integration in that way is extremely tough, because at the end of the day, I do not have a sense of belonging in those nations to begin with. They also came up and talked about that it's a question of who harmed whom. We tell you that that United States harming some other country and China harming some other country is balanced out when they both are paying for it equally. We tell you that it does not matter who you harm, it's as long as you have harmed anyone to begin with. We do not necessarily need to trace back who you have harmed to pay back. They also came up and talked about these harms were not malicious to begin with. We tell you that killing a person with a gun is not the only way to kill a person maliciously. We tell you that these people knew that the next generations or other nations will have to struggle. And they also knew that these people are not politically strong enough to stand against me. And these people do not have enough knowledge to stand up against me and protest. We tell you that the intention was same, just the method of killing these people was different, was slow and painful deaths to begin with. They also came up and talked about that these countries will not be able to survive in the lands United States and whatnot will provide. We tell you that Dubai did not have 88% of the buildings they have now back in 2000. It took them 14 years to develop. We're not saying that Maldives just will move to United States tomorrow. There'll be officials going in there, seeing the land, developing slowly, and when they find that the place is suitable now, they'll be moving their local population to those areas. Because at the end of the day, for you to develop a nation, what you need is the mind to begin with and the resources that you're about to lose. You haven't lost the resources yet. You're about to lose them, and you reallocate those resources into another country, call it your own country, and develop it. We have no problem with that. The only thing that they came up and talked about was that, there's an accountability problem. We have throughout our speeches shown that even if it is not they're not accountable to help because of the sins of their father, we talked about the capability of these nations as well. Something Team Ateneo did not respond to. We talked about that these nations have very low density population. We came up and talked about how it is a deterrence to begin with. We came up and talked about that, at the end of the day, if people realize that this is the punishment I'm receiving now, tomorrow if I commit even a serious crime which involves the environment, I'll be punished even harder. The third speaker came up and talked about that, this isn't something that is going to happen. The thing that I have fulfilled my duty, and I won't need to do anything for the environment. To which my third speaker and my second speaker came up and said that, there are reports now. If you harm the environment now, there are specific reports outlining that should harm the environment, and even if that doesn't happen, we talked about that how it's a deterrence and how it's going to be and how it's justified. So what have we proven today? We talked about how they're accountable on 2 levels because of their sense of father and how the society functions to begin with. We talked about even if it isn't true. We talked about how they're being developed. They have a moral responsibility. We talked about how alternative measures have not worked, like refugees and whatnot. We talked about damage controls have not worked. That is why we win the debate.
Thank you very much.